Good afternoon, good morning. It's not afternoon, it's good morning. This is good evening, maybe. We're gathered here today, to my great delight, to hear John DeRosa discuss his research in the context of this as a dissertation defense. We have a committee here and a group of others, and maybe it'd be a good idea to start go around the room and say who people are. Before we do that, I'd just like to give a little scenario of what we're going to do here today. John is going to describe his work. He's got a presentation for us. The committee will then ask questions and engage him on that, and then we'll open that to questions from the community. And then finally, we will ask the community to depart the premises and consult ourselves as to the quality of the work and the state we think it's in, and what we think needs to be done, if anything, subsequently. Okay? Yes? Right. So, well, I'm Sarah Cobb. I'm the chair of the committee and faculty here.
I'm Charles Davidson. I'm a PhD candidate, part of John's cohort.
Ifakhr Hallun, PhD candidate and a friend of John's. I'm so excited to be here today.
Chip House, Troublemaker.
It's central, yes.
Sue Reardon, master's student, also in the national security realm.
Audrey Williams, I'm a master's student and also the storyteller here.
Paul Snodgrass.
Sue Bryant. I'm outside on the committee. I worked with John on his master's thesis at National War College.
And I'm Solon Simmons, faculty member here as well.
Great. So, John, I have not asked you for your timing, but I assume you've obeyed the principles of deciding to present in about 30 to 45 minutes.
I'll try. 45 minutes is my mark.
Good. Okay. Great. Well, we look forward to it. Please go ahead.
Okay. To get started again, thank you everyone for coming here today. Thanks to the support from my classmates and colleagues, but specifically, obviously, to my committee. I was reminded how much my committee was part of my life this spring break. A rare opportunity to be in DC. I was waiting in the lobby, and Sue Bryant came up the elevator and stuck out her hand to my 8-year-old daughter and said, "Hi, Alessandra. You don't remember me, but the last time I saw you, you were cradled in your daddy's arms." So I've known Sue for a long time as a strategist. She has taught me that bureaucracies are the bane of strategy, but strategists need bureaucracies. So please and thank you are a necessity. She also has helped me write for a broader audience, so I appreciate all of her mentorship these years. Solon, if the search committee is still deliberating, has my certain vote for the dean of the school, the future dean of the school. Solon's Rhetorics of Civility, Legacies of Power are one of the main reasons why I came to SCAR. I am always enriched by talking with Solon. Every time I leave a discussion with him, I have a new book to read. He's made a connection between our discussion and a book that he has been thinking about. And then finally, I can't say enough about Sarah. Her mentorship, her counsel, her friendship, she has offered so much in the way of guidance, helping me to say no, helping me to say yes, letting me to say no to her when it's necessary. And whenever I'm lost, I just know if I sit still and listen for a bit, I can hear Sarah off in the distance. And she has illuminated the pathway to get me back on the direction I need to go. And all the while, being a cheerleader, encouraging me along the way. So thank you to my committee, and thank you again, everyone, for coming here. And thanks, Paul and the team for setting this event up. So on to the defense, because I promised 45 minutes or less. So if this cooperates. Okay. So the Dean of Modern Strategy, Lawrence Freeman, suggested, while examining whether war is a necessity or choice, concluded that war is always a choice, but that governments like to assert that they're following an unassailable strategic logic that permits them no alternative. The literature examining this unassailable strategic logic abounds in conflict resolution. When we study negotiations, game theory, logics of consequence appear. When we study the ethics of conflict, normative logics of appropriateness appear. And when we study the political economy of peace building and quantitative methods, the material logics of conditions appear. So it's within these logics and against this body of literature, I began exploring the proposed unassailable strategic logic. Within conflict analysis and resolution, treaties provide a breadth of cases to explore where elites in society, strategic decision makers, make choices to define who can fight wars, how wars are fought, and how wars are ended. Further, the choices to negotiate, to implement, and abide by these treaties are examined using the logics of consequence, appropriateness, and material conditions. Where the logics are used to assess strategic choices, they may vary by treaty context, but the existing logics are present in its implementation. For example, normative logics of appropriateness risk projecting norms on the subject rather than the norms held by the subjects. In the seminal work on decision-making, Graham Allison, in The Essence of Decision, investigating President Kennedy's strategic choices during the Cuban Missile Crisis, concluded that the logics of appropriateness fail to recognize changes in the rules of behavior. Preference logics of consequence do not reflect the complexity of choices being made and are bound by fixed models of utility and consequence. And I'm reminded of Vivian Jabri's Discourses on Violence, where she critiques the logic of consequence, concluding that these logics fail to incorporate the interaction of choices between actors. Then finally, the material conditions, logics of conditions, are limited to capturing changes over time. They do not account for attempts to employ treaty mechanisms or assume full and continuous implementation of these treaties. I'm also reminded of Karen Yorimilo, who concluded that with elite decision makers, at least in the case of US presidents, the logics of material conditions, while consequential to intelligence agencies, provided little influence on decision maker perceptions. Therefore, the purpose of this research is to explore an alternative logic of strategic choice that perhaps accounts for the dynamic calculations of changing circumstance, modifying preferences, and adapting expectations under conditions of uncertainty and complexity. Before I begin and explore alternative logic, I should probably begin by explaining what is meant by strategic choice. As a theory, it began in public planning as a model to help publicly elected officials make financial investments in public works under conditions of uncertainty. Later, the theory was adapted by international relations scholars to explore competitive and cooperative choices that states make under conditions of complexity and uncertainty. And most recently, Charles Glazier from George Washington University developed strategic choice as a normative theory of what choices states should make. Ultimately, strategic choice is about elite decision-making done on behalf of a collective pertaining to the use of armed force. It is from this perch that I have sought to adapt the theory for the field of conflict analysis and resolution. Research in strategic choice supports several aspects of this field. From Fearon and Layton, they describe a cognitive micro-foundation of the social construction of conflict. Richard Jackson asks how do conflict entrepreneurs choose strategies to construct conflict. He also asks, does a similar logic exist for peace entrepreneurs? And further reflecting back on my literature review, strategic choices presents an alternative logic to assess treaty dynamics. When we examine strategic choice and a potential alternative, Strategic choice scholars note that actors communicate assessments of the variables of strategic choice in their strategic logic through strategies, diplomacy, declaratory statements. If we further consider the context of those choices set at the crossroads of war and peace, war as a strategic choice requires a society-wide conflict discourse, rendering it legitimate and a reasonable course of action. The alternative logic, or an alternative logic proposed by this research, is one that narrativizes strategic choice. Narratives as an alternative logic incorporates observable calculations of the variables of strategic choice, while incorporating reflexive and dispositional characteristics demanded by complex strategic interactions. When examining narratives, structural theorists Grenius and Todorov describe a deep-level narrative grammar which underlies all languages. There's a structural logic, a morphology, and a syntax that operates within all languages. And when I think back to the unassailable strategic logic, Lawrence Friedman and Michael Walzer tell us that strategy is the language of war, the same place where actors communicate their strategic choices. Therefore, from this perch, we can perhaps borrow from the classical strategist Clausewitz and submit, if war is an outcome of strategic choice, then perhaps strategic choice has its own grammar and strategy is its narrativized logic. Therefore, strategic choice, as this research proposes, has a replicable narrative grammar. And my research question asks, what is the relationship between narrative grammar and strategic choice? In this sense, examining the narrative grammar of strategic choice, we may discover the unassailable strategic logic associated with the choices circulating when states choose war, how states choose to fight wars, and when they choose to end the war. To answer this question, two methodological methods of analysis are proposed within a case study design: process tracing and narrative frame analysis. The first method, process tracing, allows me to correlate inferences distinctly tied to historical cases. And with the second method, narrative frame analysis, I'm presented an interpretive categorization of the synthesis of strategic choice that help form that narrative logic. I have previously employed narrative frame analysis and the variables of strategic choice as a beta test in the journal article Mapping Russian Nuclear Narratives, published in 2017. So similar to the manner in which others have examined the logics of strategic choice, case studies allow for the testing of multiple models against a single case, a la Graham Allison and the essence of decision. Or they can test a single model against multiple cases in a manner undertaken by the scholarship I reviewed for this research. Specifically, either game theory, normative dynamics, or econometric studies were applied to multiple treaty cases to discover generalizable knowledge. In using purposive sampling, I've narrowed my case selection in the following manner. Beginning with homogeneous sampling, Druckmann submits that security treaties have distinct dynamics, wherein such treaties includes arms control, conflict termination, and peace treaties examined in my literature review. As a subset of security treaties, arms control treaties encompass the breadth of how states seek to ban war, regulate the conduct of war, and as a component of peace treaties, disarm after war. Following this, typical sampling allows me to narrow my focus to the 4 decades of bilateral arms control negotiations between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation, where these treaties have set the standard for other forms of arms control negotiations, including verification techniques, dispute resolution, and summit diplomacy. Finally, as a critical sample, current events will recognize that the key pillars of U.S. and Russian arms control architecture are under siege. Therefore, I selected as a macro case the U.S.-Russian arms control regime. The regime grew out of the Cold War and began with the attempts to limit the ever-expanding nuclear arms race. Several treaties formed this core architecture. First, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of '87, and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 1991. As treaties, they present cases where states seek to limit who can go to war with nuclear weapons, restrict what types of weapons are used, and with disarmament seek to end conflict. Within this macro case of U.S.-Russia arms control, I find 8 micro cases of strategic choice. To say these are micro cases might be a bit of a misnomer, but they're in no sense micro on their own, but as they set within this larger case, we'll proceed from there. Beginning from Reykjavik in 1986, which was a turning point that ensured a transition of nuclear arms control from that of limitation to actual reduction and disarmament. From that turning point in 1986, my case studies begin and end right up until this February and the American withdrawal from the INF Treaty. These micro cases also present both competitive and cooperative choices, in a sense both escalatory and de-escalatory strategic choices. And the relevant newness of the INF withdrawal may present the first case study of this critical moment. From this case study design, I'll begin to apply a theory-building approach to process tracing. Proposed by Beach and Peterson, we will answer the first question: is there a relationship between narrative grammar and strategic choice? In addition to case selection criteria, Beach and Peterson proposed the following tests of whether there is necessary and sufficient empirical evidence to prove a theory. With sequence evidence, we should expect to see the timing of events where narratives of strategic choice precede outcomes. With trace evidence, we should expect to see a relatively consistent corpus of elite discourse on strategic choice throughout the strategic interaction. And with account evidence, we should expect to see propositions of narrative grammar within the corpus of that elite discourse. So if I could simplify their model, process tracing asks if there is necessary and sufficient evidence of a chronology of the negotiations, a transcript of the conversation, and the content of those transcripts. As Beach and Peterson submit, no one to date has described process tracing for theory building in this manner. I also did not uncover the use of process tracing in this manner in my own literature review, so this research may be a methodological innovation. A narrative term to strategic choice suggests there's a synthesis of the narrative propositions of motive, perception, and preference within the dynamics of a strategic interaction. The synthesis of these propositions represents the narrative grammar of strategic choice. Frame analysis allows us to an interpretive construct to examine empirical evidence for the existence, the structure, and the function of the narrative grammar. Where motives present propositions of intent, perceptions present propositions of assessing the context of choices, and preferences present judgment of what choices are good and bad, right and wrong. Data collection for this research begins with building a case study. A compelling case study requires a narrative that's based in the historical context and the issues under examination. Who are the key players, the decision makers, their options, and their choices. So to prepare a chronology of this strategic interaction, plotting key episodes of each treaty cases, sources of these case studies are found in archival records and other documents. Some example sources that I've used in this research include official timelines of travel by the US President and Secretary of State, official visits by Soviet and Russian officials that is held by the Department of State, memoirs of key figures, whether they be secretaries of state, negotiators, Secretary Generals Khrushchev, Gorbachev, President Bush, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. I also found sources in presidential libraries and the official websites of the Kremlin, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the White House, and the U.S. State and Department of Defense. Next, to locate observations of strategic choice, I began by leveraging the chronologies that I've prepared to expose sources of critical conversations. These conversations are influential in legitimizing the policies and the strategies shaping the arms control negotiation, legitimizing the outcomes of the negotiation, and legitimizing deviance or compliance with the treaty. The literature here is very clear that placed within the context of these cases, either for the US and for the Russians or Soviets, national level strategies would be articulated publicly. The conversations of decision makers and their representatives associated with strategic choice, namely prime ministers, secretary generals, and senior level defense and foreign ministers, were the focus of data collection. I recognize that there are certainly other narratives that are orbiting these strategic choices, but those uttered by these decision makers and their representatives matter. Again, in the context of this case, the chief executives were charged with negotiating the arms control treaty. Here, traditional print and electronic resources such as radio, television, public speeches, and interviews of these influential actors provide access to the narratives shaping this landscape. I can access them both physically and electronically, but two prominent sources that I used in this research were the American Presidency Project at UC Santa Barbara, which is a web-based archive of the transcripts of all US presidents and often included remarks by foreign heads of state. But in addition, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which is a government-monitored news and information agency, former agency, that transmit anything that was transmitted in a foreign country. They translated them into English and disseminated reports of these broadcasts, and I was able to access these sources through the GMU libraries. A little quick note on computer-assisted qualitative data software. I use QDA Miner and Microsoft Excel. This allowed me to store large electronic repository where I had over 294 transcripts. It supported qualitative coding where I had over 2,500 propositions, and then helped me do both coding retrieval and other analytical tools, as you can see by the Microsoft Excel snapshot. Coding rules were utilized for both narrative frame analysis and process tracing. Within frame analysis, coding rules had designated the units of analysis to be a sequence of narrative propositions, where each text of the conversation was coded for the presence of the narrativized strategic logic of motive, perception, and preference. The coding unit was the quasi-sentence from the manifesto research, where one statement or message can equal a full sentence, multiple sentence, or parts of a sentence. For these narrative propositions, I included any conversation with regards to nuclear arms control, the negotiations of these nuclear weapons, foreign and military policy, but I excluded things such as introductions, preambles, and other government policy realms. Before I get to my findings, I should note there are no obvious ethical challenges related to the data collection or the protection of the data, as there was no direct human interaction. To promote objectivity and encourage trustworthiness, rigorous coding of small components of data was subject to peer review throughout the process. And then validity and reliability was promoted early, specifically where I was able to select complementary speech acts to promote a consistency of analysis. So what are my findings? Before I answered the core research question, I asked myself the supporting question, the theory building question: is there a relationship between narrative grammar and strategic choice? Through process tracing, I am able to conclude there is necessary and sufficient evidence to support a theory of narrativized strategic choice, where a chronology of each micro case presented a sequence where critical conversations of strategic choice preceded outcomes within each strategic interaction. Empirical evidence of 294 transcripts is readily observable throughout each microcase, and the content of the empirical material, over 2,500 propositions, demonstrate the logic of narrative grammar in critical conversations about strategic choice. So next, what is the relationship between narrative grammar and strategic choice? Within narrative analysis, narrative grammar is characterized as a structural approach. However, as I interacted with the tests, the functions of narrative grammar also revealed themselves. So first, I'm going to describe the relationship of narrative grammar from a structural perspective, guided by Todorov, Vermees, and Cobb. And then finally, I'll describe the relationship from a functional perspective, guided by Entman, Hooray, and again, Sarah Cobb. To begin, taxonomy. Drawing from Todorov and Vermees, the morphology or taxonomy begins with the variables of strategic choice. That is, the theory gives us the taxonomy of motive, perception, and preference. Within propositions of motive, I found that a paradoxical tension between peace and security dominated their motives. It is important to note that I probably didn't come up with this on my own. The speakers themselves, the first time I encountered this paradox was explicitly uttered by Secretary Khrushchev during the Cold War. It was only when I explored the functions of narrative grammar through framing and positioning that the tension revealed itself as peace for others and security for self. The next propositions of motive included legacies of power, where David Winter's The Roots of Power discuss both power over and affiliation with power. When we talk about power over, we're talking about control and we're talking about security. They were motivated by those interests. But when we're talking about affiliation with, in this sense, Russia countless times was motivated to be in a nuclear pact with the remaining superpower to garner a new sense of power, a new sense of equal power with the remaining sole superpower. Within these cases, we were delimited to security interests. However, the Cold War narrative sought to ease the economic burden of the nuclear arms race. But then as I step back and consider national security as a concept, broad economic interest has been assumed into that dialogue. So it's probably a sense of where that came from. Within propositions of perception, there's always a look back and a look forward to their choices. For example, what past presidents or secretary generals were unable to do and how future presidents or secretary generals were now able to do. They had specifically uttered that states based their decisions on their perceptions. And while Karen Yarimilo concluded that chief executives were less inclined to make decisions based on assessments of material conditions, two presidents, George H.W. Bush and Vladimir Putin, seemed inclined to do so. I can only assume that this has to do with their career in the spy business, where George Bush was the director of the CIA and Putin, obviously, in the KGB. Within propositions of preference, preference became the evaluative point of the narratives of strategic choice. It was a normative evaluation of good and bad, right and wrong. There was also an interaction of preferences where the decision maker referred to the preference of their counterpart or that of his allies. The next relationship describes operational rules for narrative grammar. That is, what is the syntax? President H.W. Bush encapsulated the syntax of the unassailable strategic logic in a single sentence at the United States Naval Academy in 1992. He concluded, "But if we hope to remain free and at peace in the world, a world that still holds dangers, we must maintain defenses adequate to the task." So despite a motive for peace, he perceived a world of danger, and therefore he preferred defenses adequate to the task. The sequence of motive, perception, and preference dominated all the critical conversations. They were not always as close in proximity as this single sentence portrays, but generally it became a broad sequential outline. However, when I considered competitive choices, for example, the withdrawal of the United States from the INF Treaty, the sequence was flipped by Secretary Pompeo. The U.S. had preferred negotiations, but perceived the treaty no longer to be affected due to Russia's actions, and the choice was motivated by the national security interests of the United States and its allies. Now, if I slip into the functional approach to narrative analysis, my research revealed that framing occurs by the narrative grammar. That is to say, some aspects of perceived reality is made more salient by the speakers. President Reagan and President George W. Bush made immorality of the doctrine of nuclear deterrence salient in their strategic choices, either to pursue the Strategic Defense Initiative by President Reagan or for Bush withdraw from the ABM Treaty. We also saw where Gorbachev, when reflecting on Reykjavik, where it was framed prominently in the news as a failure, sought to reframe Reykjavik as a success, because the breakthrough at Reykjavik was that both parties agreed to two things. First, separating the INF from START, and that negotiations about reductions were not mere limitations of nuclear arsenals. This actually, in a conversation with U.S. Secretary Schultz, became the signal that you could proceed with further negotiations. George H.W. Bush framed his choice as prudence to proceed with caution, uncertain about the transitions occurring at the end of the Cold War, but this prudence acted as a brake to the progress of negotiations, where an entire year was lost with no progress and no conversations between the U.S. and the United States on the START agreement. Russian President Yeltsin routinely spoke of how international crises complexified the arms control agenda, and his meetings with President Clinton, regularly commenting on the lengthy list of international crises that they were set to discuss. This complexity resulted in no agreement on START 3 reached by President Clinton and President Yeltsin. The text also revealed the function of positioning occurring to enable strategic choice. That is, the narrative grammar constructed roles for people and groups, imposing rights, obligations, and duties. I recall at the end of the Cold War, the position that occurred from adversaries to friends allowed for deals on New START to be reached, but also the positioning of friends and reflecting to the previous adversarial position enabled President Bush to withdraw from the ABM Treaty in 2001. The phrase "as Commander-in-Chief" ought to be familiar to Americans in the room. It's often used to prepare the listener for a strategic choice to protect the national security interests of the United States, and is often used to justify strategic choices to make a deal on nuclear disarmament. For example, President Obama routinely leveraged this phrase, "as Commander-in-Chief." Then he also added the preposition, "and in consultations with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I have concluded the following choices to preserve our security." In this sense, he was both positioning himself as the authority as Commander-in-Chief, but under the authenticity of the advice of the Joint Chiefs. Positioning occurs both in this personal level, but also at the national level, where Russian presidents Yeltsin, Putin, and Medvedev all discussed the strategic relationship following the Cold War and the need to create strategic stability between the two superpowers. But at the end of the Cold War, another prominent positioning was George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, positioning the United States as the one sole and preeminent power and the leader of the free world. Finally, the relationship between narrative grammar and strategic choice has a function of reflexivity in two respects. The first respect is the looping effect of perceptions influencing actions, where the actions subsequently shape future perceptions, similar to the security dilemma. An example in 2007, where Vladimir Putin referred to the heightened perception of insecurity caused by the U.S.-European missile defense system, hinting that they might take actions in the future to resolve these insecurities, which included a nuclear resurgence on the part of Russia and later INF breach. This would only shape future perceptions of strategic instability. Reflexivity is also an awareness of bias and a limitation of knowledge. And it's important for strategists to understand this perspective and their position when viewing the world. President Bush, though, unfortunately presents a thoroughly unreflexive strategic logic, where he anchored his perceptions of friendship with Russia, but he was biased towards strategic uncertainty that 9/11 caused, and therefore he became impervious to Russia's signaling of irreconcilable security threats caused by withdrawing from the ABM Treaty. I next consider some limitations and some possible critiques to this research. I don't claim a universal application of strategic choice, and I recognize that the origins of strategic choice theory arrived in the UK and the United States. However, other research on Soviet national security decision-making has an analogous model of social choice theory, and in addition, the empirical evidence that I reviewed consistently reflects the precedence of motive, perception, and preference within their narratives of strategic choice. So further, Gramius notes that narrative grammar is translinguistic, that is to say, common to cultures with different languages. So what I saw was that narrative grammar of strategic choice retained its form and its function through the filter of translation. That is to say, when a US president, for example, spoke to a Russian audience in English, it was translated into Russian and then translated yet again by the FBIS back into English. And we also had where Russia translations translated into English and the form and function still prevail. But I have to recognize that the shared meaning making between these two parties emerged over 7 decades of engagement between these two. That is to say that the language of nuclear arms control is dominated by the United States and Soviet and Russian discourse since the advent of the atomic age. So perhaps this language was built within this shared meaning making. There's also a limitation of public utterances versus private deliberation. Strategic choice is an elite decision-making approach. In the realm of nuclear weapons, secrecy shrouds the national security decision-making process, so therefore the meeting notes, the meeting transcripts, and the memorandums of decisions for some of these micro cases remain inaccessible to public scrutiny. However, we've begun seeing the opening of archives both within the United States and in Russia for these cases that were under review, where now private transcripts of these deliberations can be contrasted with public narratives of strategic choice. But at this time, I would have to offer that the empirical evidence used here may be the best source available to interpret strategic choice. A critique may be found in realism's demand for 100% certainty of the other's intent. While I challenge realism's ability to predict with 100% certainty the outcomes of strategic interaction, they create a significant bar to attain. I also again acknowledge that this research is limited to public utterances and analytical interpretations, but similarly with intelligence agencies, the respective parties will seek to contrast public utterances with secret deliberations. So again, I'm going to have to recommend future research to contrast this public and private challenge. Another critique could be that this is just rhetoric. The offer that I have is that the rhetoric that leaders choose to justify ideas and action are related to the expectations that are generated in the way societies will assess these events. And that politicians, and to even some extent Donald Trump, cannot say whatever they want. Some justifications resonate more widely and will be more persuasive, and they take those cues. So this research explores what rhetoric and logic they use and the impact of those choices on action. We could also see that a critique could be that they could be lying, and in matters of war, they may indeed be hiding their true intent. However, as I asserted earlier, an assumption that strategic choices for war require a discursive legitimization and justification to a broad audience. And this leaves their intent open for public discovery. So what are the implications of this research moving forward? I'd like to answer that in two parts. First, what does narrative grammar mean for strategic choice? And what does narrative grammar and strategic choice mean for conflict analysis and resolution? First, to the theory of strategic choice, three implications are prominent. First, using the Beach and Peterson model of theory building for process tracing, this may be a methodological innovation. Second, as a narrative term to strategic choice, this is a theoretical innovation wherein strategic choices in current practice prominently relies on the assessment of material position. This also is an innovation in practice where we have tools for strategy development and decision making. Whether it be peace gaming, where Peter Perla and McGrady note that wargaming and peace gaming are a participatory narrative experience where participants both participate in the construction of the narratives and are literally placed inside the narratives. So we can use this framework, the synthesis of strategic choice, as a tool for narrative analysis of these games and simulations. For red teaming and devil's advocates, organizations that employ these ideas are charged to think like the other. And this particular framework, where there's an interaction between multiple actors, provides this analytical framework. In strategy development, we're told to have strategic empathy. The theoretical assumption that strategic choice involves the interaction of choices between actors requires that we consider the other's motives, perceptions, and preferences. This may lend itself later to conflict resolution strategies as we begin to legitimize the other. Legitimizing the other's narrative, speaking the other's narrative, helps us transition our gaze now to the implications for conflict analysis and resolution. Anyone who has sat at the feet of Sarah Cobb discussing narrative and conflict resolution will recognize that legitimization of the other as a step in narrative transformation. But what this research specifically advances for the field is whether or not a collective logic exists for decision makers when they stand at the crossroads of strategic choice. This research reveals, in the context of arms control and nuclear disarmament, an unassailable strategic logic is narrated by two parties over the course of 75 years of strategic interaction. This unassailable strategic logic comes in the form of the synthesis of motives, perception, and preferences. And from this narrative analysis perch, conflict resolution interventions can be conceived to support narrative transformation towards cooperative and constructive, rather than competitive and deconstructive strategic choices. If I again reflect on Sarah's work, by using a narrative framework, it might also be possible to link the durability and effectiveness of peace agreements with either changes in the parties' stories over the course of negotiations or the incorporations of these party stories into the peace agreements. And finally, this research promotes an understanding of the structure and function of narratives with the language of war, and may reveal how decision makers bind themselves to particular choices. Again, I'm reminded of Rich Rubenstein's work on Reasons to Kill, where certain genres, certain just war sort of traditions bound the American president to certain war choices. We also found this in the research with my colleagues Angelica Martinez and John Grover, where we explored the narratives of U.S. national security and the positioning and framing of the use of military force within those strategies. For future research, we can certainly examine previous case studies. For example, the echoing of Khrushchev and President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis may give us a perch to explore Essence of Decision Volume 2. We certainly will need to contrast public utterances and private deliberations. We can also use other forms of treaty, whether it's the political or economic treaties that Druckmann notes. And the other cases and contexts that I reviewed to present either multilateral translinguistic cases for review. And then we also need to explore how does narrative grammar bind the strategic choice. With that, Sarah and panel and everyone, I open it to your questions and comments and discussion.
Thank you, John.
Very exciting work, and wonderful to see its evolution over the last couple of years. It's really just your own evolution in terms of your thinking and in the theorizing of all this. So let me turn this over to the other committee members first, and I'll follow them with questions. Solon, you want to go?
Don't we usually start outside?
Okay, we start outside, yes. Please.
Yeah.
All right. Well, John, first, how are you feeling right now?
Well, when Sarah said defense, my stomach started turning upside down.
Well, we're not forgetting. This is not just
the best defense is a good offense.
very
Well,
nice.
I'm over here, so it should get 5 words back.
Yeah, John, let me tell you just up front, it's been a privilege to watch the evolution of this, because we started this several years ago over at National War College, and it has come a long, long way. So since I have been brought in as the practitioner, I'm going to ask you some practical questions with regard to where this would go. You know, the first one that's hit me is absolutely take your idea with regard to red teaming and wargaming with this approach. My thought, given where you are, the question is always, well, what is the utility of this? If you were to be briefing your boss right now where you are, where would you say that you would say, sir, you can go here with this, but I definitely wouldn't go here with this? What are you putting as the practical limitations on this? Because as you know, military officers are always concerned about utility because it's exciting. What's your warning label on this?
So there's two things right now. The first warning label is more research needs to be had, and in particular, I would also explore using the variables that of Ken Burke's Pentad when I consider the context of these particular narratives. In fact, I was discussing this particular topic with my boss this weekend, and we're talking about the Korean conflict, where after a particular violent event, whether there be shelling on the peninsula or rocket attacks or whatever, there were state TV broadcasts on the part of North Korea describing why this occurred and for what reason. But they were challenged every single time to figure out who and for what means were these narratives. And as I thought of that, I said, well, if we were able to, which serialize the regular broadcasts, these narratives, not only in motive, perception, and preference, but also serialize them by Burke's Pentad, we could see that potentially when the act changes, when the medium changes, when the speaker changes, we can see variations in where and who the audience is for. I'd also, when I think about my role here in Europe, and I'm thinking about strategic communications and strategic engagement, the practical limitation is the ability to map the narrative landscape, do the research necessary to be able to know when and where changes occur, so that you have an idea about when to engage the narrative. That practically is a challenge because Sarah and I have discussed these sort of tools are not existent and readily available to most of the practitioners here. So we would have to expand the knowledge base of the analysts that are here to be able to use that from a practical sense.
No, when you started talking, I'm like, this is really cool, but as we go through it, I am concerned from an operator's perspective that there is wonderful potential for forensic analysis here. Whereas as you're going through trying to use it, there's a limitation. But thank you for answering that. I have one more question, and that is with regard to your time frame. You start with looking at Clausewitz and Clausewitz's grammar and moving forward. And one of the things, as you know, with regard to the curriculum at NWC is the problematization of the word war. And so when you start talking about war, particularly as you started speaking with regard to post-war nuclear, you said it'll be good after the war. It doesn't seem to me that the word war carries through in the same definition all the way. What are you really trying to bound with this?
So
Did I make sense with that question? I apologize.
So the one thing when I'm reflecting back, and maybe you can give me a quick azimuth check as I respond to, is when I think back to arms controls as a subset of treaties. In particular, as I presented, these treaties both limit who can participate in war, how war is conducted, and then how war is ended. And I suggested that these nuclear arms control agreements encompass all three sort of categories of arms control. And I think that's where your question is, where was the war that ended? So what I would offer is at least the end of the Cold War.
Okay.
Right? In that sense, and perhaps it's the challenge facing the national security community right now is this tension between the threshold of armed conflict and competition, and that balance between the two. So what we could see at least as marks of the end of the Cold War, this regime was established and was able, like other peace treaties, if you will, other peace treaties include disarmament as principles of the peace treaty. So as the Cold War ended, so have we seen disarmament between the belligerents that were the Soviet Union and the United States.
Oh, yes, please.
All right, so I want to first commend you on this piece of work. It's really fantastic, and I think that it's important for those viewers in the future, if you're watching this, to read the document, because I think there's a lot in it that we don't see even in the presentation. One of the things I want to say, and in that spirit, I have 4 questions for you, none of which are about so much the validity or the sense that this is a good piece of work for a dissertation, but more how to move forward into the publication stage, because I think it's the kind of work that we need to think about in that way. So these are therefore questions about, and I would say this. I think that your major task, and maybe the reason the presentation was structured the way it was to show how important narrative theory is for the field of strategic choice. And that I think you've accomplished effectively, and I think your presentation speaks to that and is certainly convincing in that respect. Now, my questions will address primarily how narrative is important for strategic choice. That is, how should we be thinking about narrative moving forward as a theoretical contribution? That is, what are the ways we want to address that? And so those questions are there, because I still think there's some work to be done in that respect. So the first question I have, I'm going to go back to textual references just in case, and if you don't have them in front of you, at least then I'll read it to you what stood out to me. Has to do with the language of strategic choice, which still, if you will, pervades the document. That is, in a way, you haven't been party to my most recent thinking to this, which I call root narrative theory, but in a sense, everything you're doing here fits within what I call a securitarian logic. That is, the main sense of power that is in play here is military logic, which makes perfect sense. But I think it might speak to other issues if we were able to somehow get outside that. So, for example, you say on page 27. Within strategic choice, 2 types of variables influence the logic of strategy, material and information. And I brought this up before, but as you move into what I'd call a more thoroughly broad, that is not so specifically securitarian perspective, but introduce other questions like questions of human rights and governance, questions of human dignity and race and ethnicity, and questions like that which have their own logics. maybe material and information isn't everything, because what it seems to me is that there's something about interests and symbols, which is also a way to break this out. That material and information are still physical things. They're not at the level. In another place in the document, you talk about the construct. I think it's when you talk about the logic of narrative logic and security. Ronald Krebs' work in particular. You mentioned the idea of the importance of constructs. Material and information seem to me part of a particular construct. So I wonder about that. And in the same question, there's a reference on page 36, and this is about how you translate narrative into strategic logic. Because you keep coming back to motive, material, and information, and I see in the document where this matters, because you're setting up this really interesting discussion about narrative grammar and what have you, and then there's a point where the deus ex machina just happens, which is these three components coalesce into the function of strategic choice expressed as a synthesis of three variables: motive, material, and information, which is obviously a reference to Glaser's relational theory of international politics. So you're doing this work where you're bridge building and you're saying, hey, this is where I can enter in. But as a theory of narrative, I'm not yet convinced that motive, material, and information is the fundamental building block. So what is it that appeals to you about framing the question in that way and framing it in terms of material and information and variables and so on? So tell us why that was so important, which I think it was, and why you might want to move forward or not with that moving forward.
Okay, so there's a number of questions. Let me go from the last question backwards only. Why narrative? Actually, this probably answers why narrative is so important to strategic choice. As I wrestled with particularly Glaser's model of strategic choice, the variables of motive, material, and information, what I came to, and this is perhaps just my personal approach to the world and to the research, is that material conditions need some sort of animation, right? They're inanimate. A tank is there but needs purpose. These nuclear weapons needed purpose, and the purpose is given through this assessment, through the narrative, where we animate these material conditions. Now, certainly, material conditions just exist, but if we decide to use them to advance a strategy, we have to make an assessment, and that assessment then is translated in a narrative sense. I'm fascinated by your question about what about symbols when we realize this. I think what I missed in this particular research is the visualization of this, and you've probably seen it in my presentation.
Yeah.
You saw the visualization of officialness, right? Diplomacy and officialness, where leaders of countries are represented by a single person. Entire nations are represented by a single person. Their flags are behind them. That gives them an authority to make these particular choices on behalf of their collective. So there is symbology that's involved in this particular realm, and we probably should consider that even more. This morning, as I was thinking about and as I was preparing for this, I thought that perhaps where narrative and strategic choice, I was thinking back to what Sarah offered, right? During my process tracing, how uncomfortable I felt that every single case proved a theory of narrativized strategic choice. And I said to myself, you referenced Krebs, I'll also reference Kubiak, that perhaps I have an answer to the chicken and egg question, where narratives is the chicken and the egg is strategic choice. Because I think back on both Krebs' discussion of war narratives, but also Jeff Kubiak's book on war narratives, where he said that intent and risk-taking decisions and preferences, policy preferences, are all encompassed in narrative. So perhaps the reason why I saw these perceptions of motive, these propositions of motive, perception, and preference so prevalent throughout it, is because they automatically exist in these particular types of narratives. So in this case, the chicken did come before the egg. The narratives had the dynamics of the structural form, the functional form, and then strategic choice was just perhaps the contextual way I viewed these particular narratives, and which is why it's probably important, again, to consider other treaties, whether they be political treaties or economic treaties, and whether the same sort of decision-making occurs under these other contexts that were presented.
Great. That was actually just the first question. We try to be quick with the others. So, what is narrative grammar? You talk about on page 28. You get into this and you say, this is your question, right? What is the relationship between narrative grammar and strategic choices for war? So, just in a nutshell, and this matters because it's a big topic of debate in the field. By the way, that's why I ask you, and I think you're joining. So I want you to stake out your position in this. So what we all refer to narrative grammar. What the heck is it?
So when I speak of narrative grammar, I'm just relying on the literature that both Gremius, Todorov, and even Sarah in her own scholarship described that there is a structure, a taxonomy to the narrative, and it operates in a certain way and creates itself, that perhaps there is a finite form of narrative based on these structures that are existent. It is, as why I related it in this sense, it is the logic of how the narrative is operating. Okay. If I would summarize it in that sense.
Okay. And is that, but when you say that, the three things you state out, preference, motive, and what is the third one? Perception. Are those the components of narrative grammar as you're presenting it?
That is what I'm offering as the narrative grammar of strategic choice.
Got it. That's what I wanted to pin that down. So that's interesting, and it's a particular take on it, and very interesting. So I just put a pin in that. So what is it? Okay, this goes back to your broad method, and that is this question 3, and it has to do with process tracing and your claims about the novelty therein. So you talk about understanding process tracing, and I think it's really interesting. I think more and more of our students are excited about a historical approach, and you've done fantastic historical discursive work. And I want to say another thing, which is to say what you may have unearthed are what we might call fabula or master narratives of strategic thinking. That is, and you haven't sort of laid those out in the presentation, but in the text, by this close analysis, you are laying out what these master narratives might be, which for practice would matter, because then you know, how are the Russians going to narrate this? How are the Americans going to narrate this? How are the North Koreans going to narrate it? And just training practitioners to be facile in that context, to say, here's how it's going to come, here's how they're going to lay out these 3 aspects, and so on. So that might be an interesting thing that you might think about moving forward from a practical point of view. But what is it that, in your view, that makes process tracing different from historiography in a more traditional sense? That is, historians study this stuff all the time. They have a way of, they have a methodology, if you will. As you think of your own work, what is it that makes it different from history and that makes process tracing maybe interesting for other students to use as a methodological approach?
So the first point that I would make on the novelty of it is that I think the novelty is just the association of innovation with that I haven't uncovered to this point other sources that have used the Beach and Peterson model of theory building for process tracing. And perhaps that's the novelty when I compare it against the historiography, where not necessarily are they trying to create a theory in this particular sense. I was trying to build a theory of narrativized strategic logic, and I used process tracing or maybe historiography as a method to affirm that particular theory. But what you also suggested is how we could apply this to the field moving forward. And I think the best example is actually the article that I referenced that I did with Sue at the National War College in mapping Russian nuclear narratives. That particular project was useful not only from a beta test, sort of, if you will, of this particular methodology, but as I was familiar with very significant propositions about nuclear weapons, they became, through that earlier research, they became more prominent to me as I looked at the narratives in this particular research, which is why you see the terms strategic instability, nuclear resurgence. These were of the 5 master narratives, if you will, or larger Russian nuclear narratives. And by having a grounding in that narrative landscape, I'm able to see variations and changes, whether who is uttering that particular narrative, when and to whom they're uttering. So I had to be grounded in that particular narrative landscape to be able to make some of these assessments that I had to do.
Great, thank you. I love that language of mapping the narrative landscape. I think that's really interesting and I think more broadly useful for the field. And the last question is maybe simple, maybe not. So if there was strategic choice involved throughout this whole process you studied, what could have been different?
What could have been different than the strategic choices that they made?
Yeah.
You're going to permit me a moment to ponder this for a second. So I wonder, and this also speaks to how particular narratives bind choice. I wonder how, you mentioned it also earlier, Solon, how these master narratives or this master narrative of strategic choice dominated. Perhaps that was at play, that there were other narratives circulating that forced the choices that were made, that, or at least bound these actors to choices, rather than where I propose that this is a dynamic condition of changing preferences, modifying expectations, that perhaps because of, Solon, you were the one who charged me to do this sort of preface and prologue chapter, right? From the dawn of the nuclear age up until Reykjavik, what were the narratives circulating? And we saw those narratives come forward into the conversations within these case studies that I pursued. So there, perhaps again, there were other narratives that may not give the freedom of choice as I might be suggesting moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
John, again, like everybody else has said, this is just a tour de force, really interesting piece of work, and I've been delighted to be associated to it and watch it evolve. I wanted to go back to where you just ended with Solon, because my big question is about the oxymoron of strategic choice, which I have felt in my gut, from the start of the project. And I feel it when I look at the history of these peace agreements and the treaties and their evolution. And it really comes down to I guess I'm anxious about the deployment of a discourse, or let's say a deployment of a narrative grammar, using this language, that is going to delimit significantly what kind of choices people can make. So that seems to me, in order to make that point, either we have to say from the beginning, you have to define this, and you've chosen to define in your book, in your work, strategic choice in terms of motive preferences and perceptions, rather than making that a finding of the dissertation. Do you see what I'm saying? You've chosen to pre-define the nature of the narrative grammar, and then you go look for it and it's there, right? I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just worried that I'm worrying about how to how to show in the work this oxymoron, this notion of choice that's not really a choice. So I wouldn't ask you to flip this and make the strategic choice theory that you put forward a finding rather than an analytic tool. But I am concerned that the fox is the hen house, right? You know, it goes back to what Solon was talking about, this nature of the securitarian discourse being the only discourse that any of this is discussed in. So of course we're going to have these three things, and they're going to keep appearing. And then it occurred to me, listening to you, something I hadn't really noted as I read the document, was that this notion of master narrative could be really useful as a conclusion, as a way of pointing back to the limits of this securitized discourse, or the limits of quote unquote strategic choice. And I think warning, I guess that's what I'm hoping for, warning folks that you don't have a lot of choice here, that there are not a lot of choices. And I don't know whether that's, again, you don't know because you didn't do this work yet, whether that's a function of, from a Foucauldian perspective, the discourse deployed is the discourse we get. No surprise there. Or whether or not there are dynamics in the narrative landscape that you mentioned that we can't see because we didn't have that frame, that really show how this discourse is inevitably constrained by the forces in the narrative landscape. So that led me to the question of whether or not you might give us a hint about, and this is my question finally, might give us a hint on what we'd pay, how would we do this sort of narrative landscape analysis if you've done all this work. Do you have any insights for us or any thoughts on how, I'm not talking about altering the document, I'm talking about following a line of argument here about why this is so constrained.
So there's two things I would start off by saying is I agree with you, Sarah, that there are discourses, there are narratives that already circulate that bind our choices. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just lost the video. That's all right. And I'm thinking to the current debate on grand strategy that's occurring as we move towards the next presidential election cycle in the United States, where there seems to be a conflict between those who want to advance the liberal international order and those who want to think about restraint in foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Both those two grand strategy schools of thought, if you will, already from the start define what choices are available based on that particular narrative that you identify with. So yes, indeed, I think the master narrative that takes hold within a particular society already delimits the strategic choices that are available. And as I just finished Jeffrey Lagos's book on how new ideas, particularly in foreign policy, gain traction, where shock has to occur, where there has to be a body of an alternative idea available with practitioners and speakers who can advance that particular new foreign policy. So yes, I agree that there is delimiting. I would offer, though, the importance of this is actually goes back to, you mentioned it, Sarah, the as an analytical tool.
Right.
So I in my dissertation, I noted the practical application of strategic choice, at least within the Department of Defense,
Sure.
where the strategic choices and management review done after the Budget Control Act to decide what sort of defense strategy and budget resourcing they would pursue. Also with the Office of Net Assessment, But where I began with the strategic choices and management review and the think tanks that also participated in it, what they didn't have was a mechanism that forced them to think about the dynamic, complex environment and the interaction of other people's choices and other people's narrative. They remained nested and anchored in their own narratives without thinking about the other. Now, Office of Net Assessment, in their particular methodology, while they don't call it strategic choice theory, I see the workings of strategic choice as they go through, for example, wargaming exercises that make them consider how the other is talking. So, again, I want to recognize that, yeah, I certainly believe there's some master narratives that are limiting choices, but if we use this as a narrative tool to explore both our own choices and the choices of the other, I think we might be able to break down this this delimited model of just as we begin thinking about others and other choices. And I think the way to get after that, it goes back to this idea of mapping the narrative landscape. And what I would offer there in mapping the narrative landscape, you've got to begin by understanding who is speaking and what are the conditions, what are the networks, if you will, of these speakers and influencers. Where are what is the constellation of narratives, whether they be your dominant narratives, master narratives, or supporting narratives, and complementary narratives, where this is, who's speaking, where the interaction is, so that without this, the military folks in the room would recognize if you didn't do your leader's recon or your map analysis before an operation, you have no idea where you're going. So if you haven't mapped this narrative landscape, you don't know where you're going to proceed in narrative interventions moving forward.
Well, I have another point here, and then I'll turn it over to people from outside the committee. That's an interesting description, and I think it begins to hint at how we might do this narrative landscape analysis. But I wanted to go back to the practical issue of what you said, the way in which motive, preference, and perception as the grammar could provide a framework for doing exactly what you just said, which is enabling people to be reflexive. Because I think it'd be interesting for me, I'd like to go back through the research and see empirically where there was reflexivity and where there wasn't. And whether that reflexivity is associated to any sort of what we might in the field of conflict resolution call positive change, whether it's significant in that regard or not. So that's my question.
So to explicitly answer the question of where the reflexivity occurs and whether it was positive change,
Yeah.
I would offer reflexivity occurred and there was not positive change. It was more of destructive choices that were made whenever reflexivity occurred. So, for example, I reflect back to President Putin's Munich Security Conference, his statements. His reflexivity forced them to make more competitive choices, i.e. a nuclear resurgence within Russia, the eventual breach of the INF treaty, but also the unreflexive logic of President Bush as the other example, where he was blinded. And why I bring this up, particularly from a strategy perspective, and it's important, while I remember going through the courses at the National War College, and there was certainly a course on strategic culture and the importance of having empathy. What seemed to dominate that conversation was not the perspective of the other, right? What they were narrating as their motives, their preferences, and perspective, but material drivers of change that dominated the choice for strategy development. And what they did was impose upon the world, if you will, U.S. perceptions of the material drivers of change, and impose that, whether it be economic driver, whether it be a demographic driver, whether it be a political driver, and impose it equally on the world. At the same time, speaking out of the side of their mouth, saying you have to be empathetic to the other's views, but without having a tool, if you will, for the strategists to be empathetic. You just impose your own condition.
Could the strategic choice, if you defined it, be that tool? That's one of my questions. So that if you took motive, preference, and perception, and you doubled it, there was a doubling of that, and I think you used that word doubling in your presentation today, because I wrote it down, or maybe you said it, or I thought it, where you've got consideration of the motives of the other, you've got consideration of the preferences of the other, you've got consideration of the perceptions of the other, and that that doubling could enable the kind of reflexivity that that I was imagining.
I didn't show the figure, Sarah. I didn't show the figure in this presentation, but you might recall in the document itself where I showed a formula, if you will, of using Glazier's model of strategic
I remember
choice,
that.
showing strategic interaction, where strategic interaction was strategic choice A within strategic choice, the synthesis of motive perception. So one country that synthesized or contrasted against the choice of another country,
Right.
and those two choices together may come with an outcome, but most often it was multiple choices and a reflexivity between those choices that led to the final outcome. Because, as a complex adaptive system, these things are only dispositional. They're not linear in causation. So what we saw was I made a choice, or at least I narrated a choice. Country A narrated a choice. Country B narrated a choice, which caused country A to narrate a new choice that could have been aligned, right? It could have been aligned with country B's choice, or it could diverge depending on whether they were taking a competitive or a cooperative approach.
Well, thank you, and my hope is that that your next paper after the book is published is on training negotiators, because this has tremendous implications, in my view, for how we unlimit the delimited choices of negotiators. So this, I think, there's also negotiation theory embedded in this. It has implications for negotiation theory, I believe, that would be rather significant. So I'd like to see an article developed on that, and I might not sign until that appears there. How's that for a threat? Just really, really interesting, John. So let me open it up to other people from the community.
John, a comment and then a quick then I'll lurk toward a question. The comment. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. A comment and lurking toward a question. The comment I'm channeling from my wife, who was an FBIS lifer, and she would make the case that the best data one has on issues like this are open source data. That what one can get from covert intel is probably less likely to be accurate, so she'd be very happy. The question really kind of grows out of Sarah's, and I'm not particularly interested in, nor do I particularly understand the methodology and logic of doing this kind of analysis, but as I was listening to you, and especially after you raised the Office of Net Analysis, I began thinking about people I knew who were affiliated with that world. And they would be making the case that Sarah's point is an important one, and which is that embedded in what you're talking about here are, actually embedded in what you're not talking about here are lessons for negotiators, whether they're superpower leaders or anyone else. And that goes back to Sarah's point that there were certain things that just weren't said in these discussions. And it gets back to your sense of strategic empathy. One of the people that Andy Marshall knew best was a guy named Jerry Post, who was a psychiatrist at the agency who tried to figure out what the inner workings of people like Arafat in the day were so that our planners could better figure out how to deal with him. And I also think about a guy named Leon Firth, who you may even know, who talks about anticipatory planning, and that you need to try to figure out the questions that aren't being asked, especially at a time like ours of tremendous rapid change. And so the question, I think, and therefore I certainly don't know the answer, the question, I think, takes you beyond the thesis, to beyond how, it goes back to Sue's initial question to you. If you're talking to your boss or you're talking to the acting Secretary of Defense, what is the one lesson from your thesis that they should carry over into their next negotiation? I think that's my question.
So I'll address that question last, but I would also like to address your comments, Chip. One, I agree with what your wife is saying, that the open source material may be the best source. What I would offer that those other means, and in fact, what they say, and there's someone in the room that might be helpful, a little bit more helpful in this regard. When we talk about all source intelligence, that particular methodology gives us greater confidence in the perhaps what we have found in the open source, right? So the open source might allow us greater access, but the other more technical means, the more covert or clandestine means of gaining information, gives us confidence in our analysis. It's just triangulation, if you will, bringing other sources to bear on the problem at hand. On the Office of Net Assessment, I will disclose that I went through their competitive strategies course, and I did pose this question because it was during my dissertation time that I went through this course about narratives, and they certainly find great value in exploring the narratives of the other. But I think the charge that Andy Marshall gave them was not to be tied to any particular method, to let the empirical evidence drive your questioning of the material and further examination. So while I may have seen strategic choice at play in their competitive strategy and net assessment methodology, I harken back to their caution that Andy Marshall seemed to regularly give, is don't tie yourselves to a particular methodology. And then your question was, what is the one lesson that you would give Acting Secretary Shanahan? Is the same point that I made about strategic choices and the management review, the skimmer that occurred after the Budget Control Act. You have to start listening to the other, and not the other that is actually our own narratives. I'll make a quick point that what I found in mapping Russian nuclear narratives, there was a single proposition over 4 years of the second Putin presidency that a Russian commentator said that Russia is the only country able to turn the United States into radioactive ash. In 4 years of propositions that were uttered by the Russians, that was only said one time. However, if you went into the U.S. circle, particularly the Beltway circle, that particular proposition was circulated over and over and over again to become our narrative about the Russians. So I would argue that, again, listen to the others, narrative, but be careful that it's not our narrative of the other.
So, thank you. Great question. We have time for, actually, what do I want to do? I think what we'd like to do is have the committee consult now. And while we would love to take questions already, we've been rather verbose, or at least I feel I have.
Never happens
So,
before.
right. So your committee has conferred, John, and I'm delighted to tell you that you passed the defense. Yay! And you are Dr. DeRosa official. So we are totally prepared to sign the document today, which is unusual in my book. I don't see that all the time, and it's just because we think this has been a thorough, excellent, and comprehensive approach to the topic, and we're really pleased with the content and where you've come. It's really good.
I have to express my gratitude to each one of you on the committee for your guidance, your comments, your support and encouragement along the way. But also, as I mentioned back to my colleagues that are in the room that came, their inputs. I remember Charles helping me think through comprehensive exams and getting through that burden. I have my whiteboard over here to help me take chunks of chapters and outline them out in detail with sources. Bakira in our narrative praxis classes and that interaction between and the practice of narrative, where we were able to talk with, well, as it turns out, Nadia, who is now a Nobel laureate, right? When we did narrative grading for non-combatants in Syria, Nadia is now a Nobel laureate for peace. So it's quite interesting that we had the opportunity to work that Bakira and I shared to interview her when she was just a young lady.
It's fabulous. And I know there have been a lot of wonderful contributions, and you've been very much part of the community, even in your absence. And it's sort of, you've been a generative force, I think, for all of us here. And I'm really so wonderful. It's been wonderful to working with you. We have 4 things we'd like you to do. And again, we're ready to sign today, so these are all very minor. One is just a really good proofreading. There's a couple of spelling mistakes, prop is pop, and etc. So just do a really good proofreading. Second, on chapter 4, on the first page, we noted that there's a reference to the bombing of Nagasaki as occurring the next day after Hiroshima, and it actually didn't. So that might have been a rhetorical device on your part, but we'd like for you to get it factually correct. Then we had 2 other things that were slightly more substantive. One was there was enthusiasm amongst us for your noting that your tool of the way you frame strategic choice as a set of propositions of motive, preference, and perception could be used for change. In other words, it could be used to support the training of practitioners. And that was really Sue's point, that helping them think about the motives of the other, the perceptions of the other, the preferences of the other, et cetera. And calling that out as a resource for folks. Yoo-hoo! It's not just an analytic tool, but a prospective training tool would be really interesting for negotiation. That was one thing, and we think that could be done in a paragraph there at the end when you're talking about, red teaming or gaming or whatever you want to. Where the second one was really the point that Solon drove home about, that I thought was so important about the discourse of strategic choice itself, with the way you've defined it, et cetera, and that goes back to it was Glaser's formulation as well. That is within a securitarian discourse. Now, Solon's finished his root narrative theory, or let's say developed it, in tandem to your work, so there was no way you could use his work for yours. But maybe a nice paragraph at the end on how this discourse is itself part of what we might see as a securitarian discourse, which we had a laugh in the other room because Sola and I were talking about the way in strategic choice is limiting, and that it is an oxymoron. And Susan was saying, "Are you kidding? This is a massive, expansion." So we'd love to hear that. But yeah, it is. But we thought it'd be interesting to just have this note, maybe drawing in root narrative theory, and just a paragraph there at the end, somewhere
I can
to.
send you the material so you can do that too.
Yeah, so it's not anything other than a reference to that this is one of different discursive universes, right? And or as a typology.
As we said, you wonder what Martin Luther King would do in strategic choice space, and it's
Yeah.
probably different.
It's probably very different, right? Very good. So those are 4 small things. I'll write them down for you in an email. But as I said, we're ready to sign today. Now, we did discuss on the way back that we hope that are you coming to walk? Are you coming to graduation?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, yes, because we were going to force that as well, as a sword of Damocles over your head.
I was able to nest a required week-long course in Virginia with graduation.
Wonderful, John. Well, yeah, in May.
In May.
We'll look forward to seeing you there. So again,
Awesome. And I'm scheduled, I haven't got the final word, and I think I shared with you, Sarah, to be in DC
yeah,
the week of the 22nd,
through the 26th.
26th, on Russia strategic behavior, so at RAND, so maybe I can bring some of this conversation there,
Yeah.
but also the opportunity to see you all, coffee, beer, scotch, whatever. It took us about a conversation about wargaming and other things.
Really, really interesting. Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and John, thank you again.